Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's event on political blogging, the Political Network. My name's Gavin Freegard, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Orwell Prize, and we're delighted to be here at Cheltenham for the first time, supporting two events, including tonight's. The Orwell Prize rewards the best political writing in the United Kingdom, the writing which comes closest to George Orwell's ambition to make political writing into an art. Every year we give a prize to the book, to the journalist, and since 2009 to the blogger, which comes closest to that ambition. And in fact, Oliver was longlisted for the prize a few years ago, and Graham is this year's Orwell Prize for Blogs winner. But as you can tell from the fact that we're here, we do much more than that. We've tried to take events around the country to literary festivals and elsewhere to get people talking and thinking about politics and political writing. And that's why we're particularly thrilled to be working with Cheltenham for the first time. Well, without further ado, I'd like to thank Oliver and Graham for taking part tonight, to the festival for working with them for the first time so wonderful, and of course to you for coming, and also to our chair for this evening. Thank you to Julia, who I know hand you over to. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I wonder whether, as we're such an intimate audience, we might have the house lights up so that we can sort of include you and gather you into our fray. See the whites of your eyes, really, and include you in the conversation. So a very warm welcome to one of the last events of the Cheltenham Festival. We're going to go out on a high. As Gavin said, my name's Julia Wheeler, and I'm delighted to be here this evening to talk with Graham Archer and Oliver Cam about political blogging, and this is part of the Power Play strand of the Cheltenham Festival. Oliver Cam began his career at the Bank of England, became an investment banker, and 3 years ago left the city for journalism and the Times, among other publications. He's a leader writer and columnist for the Times and describes his politics as immoderate liberal. He says he believes that Tony Blair was the greatest peacetime Prime Minister of the 20th century, and as Gavin mentioned, he was longlisted for the Orwell Prize for blogging in 2009. Graham Archer is, in his own words, a 41-year-old civilly partnered vegetarian Tory who lives in Hackney and is mildly obsessed with swimming. More relevant perhaps, he writes on the Conservative Home website about conservative politics and London life, and he's the winner of the 2011 Orwell Prize for Political Blogging. Please welcome your political blogging panel one more time. I think it would be good to begin with a political blogging landscape. Where are we? Where has it come from? The left and the right, so on. Graham.
I think, first of all, sorry to keep going on about thank you and everybody, thank you so much for coming along to listen to us. I am gobsmacked to be here, and I can't believe it's so many. We're up against Julia Mackenzie and the Archers, and that nice in that sound, so thank you very much. I think I was trying to prepare, I'm a statistician. We're rubbish at predicting the future, but we're not bad at describing what's just happened. When I look at what's happened in the last few years, I think you can see a trend, a consolidating trend. We started off blogging as individuals, and certainly on the right of centre, through websites like Conservative Home, Ian Dale, there seems to be a consolidation of individual writers into these platforms. I don't know whether by accident or by design. Certainly when you come together, you get more of your voice is sort of magnified and can compete more easily with the mainstream media. Interestingly, you see the mainstream media also starting to consolidate their blogs under various umbrellas. Comment is free in the Guardian. So, one thing I'm not sure about though is if that process has much further to go. I'm not sure if it's happened so much on the left as it has on the right. That might be a question for Oliver.
I think that over the past decade, political blogs have become an indispensable part rather than an idiosyncratic part of political debate, and this is likely to continue with an effect that I regard as almost entirely destructive of the quality of political debate. Blogs encourage polarization and the shrillest of political voices. They are a centrifugal force in political debate that operate with a sort of feedback loop on the mainstream media. I don't like to use the term dumbing down because it is a cliche in itself, but the type of approach to political argument that blogs represent has become standard among quite august publications. Take the New York Times, where one of its most prominent columnists, Paul Krugman, a very brilliant economist, has become far better known for depicting the previous US administration as theocratic, criminal, and bellicose in a way that, in my view, is not remotely comparable in sophistication to his economic analysis, which I studied as an undergraduate. In my view, blogs encourage reduction of complex issues, not even to caricatures, because caricatures at least have some element of veracity within them. It really is true that John Prescott is fat. It really is true that General de Gaulle had a big nose. Those are caricatures. What blogs do is to reduce complex issues to partisan crudities and diminish the sort of commentary that mainstream newspapers themselves have. That, I think, is inevitable, but greatly to be regretted. And I think that both on the right and on the left, that process is going to continue apace.
I think there's obviously a germ of truth in that. I think you could be mistaking the content of the blog itself with the fact that another revolution which has happened in the last few years is not so much about blogging, it's about the electronic age that we live in, is that you get instant feedback from the readers, and if I can speak as somebody who writes above and below the line, as the Guardian puts it, below the line, it's the comments below the line that I find the shrillest and the most unpleasant. Of course you can find a blog which tries to reduce everything to a simple bipolar world of black and white, right and wrong, right and left. I don't think the best ones are like that. There's an element, if you would say that, there, of course. It's the stuff that people feel free to communicate instantly now, which is, I think you described completely accurately. And of course, it's very difficult not to respond to it. My partner spends his life telling me not to read the stuff that people say about me, and certainly never ever rips off stuff. How dare you write that about me?
You never read it just before you go to bed.
Or before you come onto a stage like this one. I think that's the look that I see, which is not altogether a healthy aspect of modern writing.
But part of your consolidation argument is also presumably that the cream will rise. Because there's so much out there, not everybody's going to read everything. So eventually through consolidation and through just things being more articulate, more decent than other things, then some blogs won't survive, will they? They'll just be out there in the ether, as it were.
Forever. Yeah.
But I mean, no, but they may last days or weeks, but they're not going to endure.
Yes, I was thinking of something else that Oliver said and wanted to react to. You feel that pollution is also like a pollution sweeping over political journalism. And I've been thinking since I started writing for the Daily Telegraph about the difference between proper journalism and the sort of writing I do. I don't think of myself as a journalist at all, which comes as any surprise to anyone. But my friends and my family say, "Oh, it's amazing! You're in the paper now. You're joining the National Union of Journalists." And I think that I'm not that sort of writer. I'm just trying to describe stuff that I see as well as I can, and how it makes me feel. And so I stay outside. Whereas good political journalists have to be inside and close to the sources of power that they're talking about. Now, I don't see those two things are different, but I don't see them antithetical to one another. I don't see that having the outer voice in the pages of the Telegraph or the Times takes away from that insider, almost establishment political journalism. I don't see them in opposition.
They are different things. I mean, I don't see myself as a journalist either. I'm a pundit. I write opinions, both the opinions collectively of the Times and its editorial columns, and opinions of my own in side columns. I've never reported anything. This is my only job in journalism. I came to journalism as a blogger. My initial punditry was in a blog. I was invited to contribute to the Times and eventually to join the Times. I think that my own experience as a blogger becoming a pundit is likely to become quite a common part of the newspaper industry. But I can't but regard this as a negation of the proper role of newspapers. You talk, Graham, about the insiders and the outsiders, but the real distinction between journalism, as I understand it, and blogging is that journalism is founded on something. Newspapers, such as let's take neither of ours, such as The Guardian, which I greatly admire as an institution, whose comments on blogs are a separate matter, whose foreign journalism I greatly admire. I think its foreign coverage is quite outstanding. It's because The Guardian has a basis of news values and of real expertise. Let's take the Balkans, a subject that is politically contentious, where it has a store of expertise of very fine journalist Ed Viliami, who's covered it for a long time. There's some real content there, there's some real accuracy, commitment to journalistic truth. Bloggers themselves don't have that resource. They are one of two things. They're either parasitic upon the resources of newspapers that they read and consume but don't contribute to, or their approach, which is to simplify, to make crude ideological generalizations about complex issues, itself feeds back into newspapers in the way that I've described. So that on newspaper blog sites, specialist newspaper blog sites, I don't particularly want to identify failings in those of other newspapers, but newspaper blog sites become an echo chamber for shrill malcontents, both in your terminology, Graham, above the line and below the line. And the problem is that people nowadays don't even have to surf the web in order to get their preferred source of supposed information. They get it through RSS feeds, through subscribing to emails, and the type of site that is popular in these circumstances is the sort of site that deals in ideological certainties of the right or the left. It's a constant process of ratcheting up the rhetoric, talking to each other, these small closed circles of consumers of blogs, writing comments and reinforcing the prejudices that they express, even to the point of making frankly absurd conspiracy theories part of the mainstream of newspaper culture. This is something that's quite recent, quite destructive, and I see very little prospect of its being reversed. But political bloggers have done that, and I much regret it.
I'm still not sure I agree. I can understand that which you're describing. I'm not clear that it's evident that that feedback process is a function of the fact that technology has enabled anyone to write a blog, and the fact that the same technology has enabled anyone to express an instant opinion on anything written by anybody. I don't see. Can I tell you the honest truth? The stuff that gets written. Sorry, I know, terrible cliche. George Orwell shaking his head in his grave. Fumbling for the words. That's all. When I look at the comments that were written under the pieces that I wrote on Conservative Home, which they weren't very political pieces I wrote there. They were much nicer than the ones. I also blog at the New Statesman. The comments that are written under my piece there in this supposed intellectual magazine of the left are frankly disgusting. And I see sometimes, I can't see the difference between the comments that are left under writing that I'm paid for in the Telegraph and blogs that I did for free on Conservative Home or at the Statesman. I think it's the technology that gives this instant, anonymous feedback, which leads to the deleterious effects on public debate. That's not to say I've proven that you're mistaken in your assumption, but I just think the hypothesis is perhaps slightly wider than the way you've expressed.
I think there are two issues here. One is the power of digital technology for everyone to express a view publicly, instantly, and the quality of views that you find on, let's say, the comments threads of Comment is Free. It's very poor. It's very poor. Before I joined the Times, I would write occasionally for the opinion page of The Guardian and also blog posts for Comment is Free. And because I happen to think that Tony Blair is not a war criminal and indeed was rather an effective Prime Minister, you can imagine the type of comments that were
Probably
underneath my articles. Not merely vitriolic, not even merely obscene, but for some reason highly anti-Semitic. I'm not myself Jewish, but for some reason comments about, and I'm quoting, I'm not paraphrasing, comments about sick-minded Jews tended to crop up in these comments threads to an extent that I think Guardian editors didn't expect, certainly were shocked by, and put in place. I've discussed this with Jonathan Friedland, the well-known Guardian columnist. Certainly the Guardian put in place much more rigorous moderation of comments, and I don't think has dealt with the issue because, of course, you can't deal with the issue infallibly with comments that are posted immediately and reflect the mental processes of people of widely varying degrees of political sanity. But this, I think, is a separate question from what I'm talking about. Let's take the example of Conservative Home, a very important element of online political debate, and which has well-considered articles and comments that, from your experience, Graham, are some may be wacky, some may be absurd, but
some of them are horrible.
Okay, I don't generally look at the comments, but I think even in the case of Conservative Home, which I regard as an important element of online debate, I regret the influence that it has. And I remember an address that George Osborne gave a few years ago, when, of course, the Conservatives were in opposition, paying tribute to the work of Conservative Home in bringing to the parliamentary party and to the shadow cabinet, as it then was, the opinions of grassroots Conservative members and supporters. If there's one thing I do not want the Conservative Party in Parliament to reflect, it is the opinions of grassroots Conservative supporters, any more than I would have wanted or did want the Labour Party in the 1980s to be in tune with the views of its activists. Activists in any political party are almost by definition unrepresentative of public opinion, because the biggest interest group in the British public comprises those who are not particularly interested in politics. Inevitably, if you're a political party seeking to govern, you need to understand how politics works. And politics works in two ways, preeminently. First, you realise that not all things that we value are strictly compatible with each other. Liberty and equality are not necessarily compatible with each other. And, for example, and the task of politicians in government is to trade off some things that we value against other things that we value. It's part of the stuff of political debate that Conservatives will prefer one trade-off and Social Democrats will prefer another trade-off. The type of politics represented by blogging doesn't conceive of trade-offs. The type of politics understood by party activists doesn't conceive of trade-offs. It doesn't understand that politics involves values that are in Isaiah Berlin's term, incommensurable. They can't be measured on the same scale. And it's not possible to create a good society. What's important is to create an element of social peace. Some things I will defend almost absolutely. Free speech I will defend almost absolutely against the demands of religious objectors or those who find particular forms of speech offensive. But this is something that needs to be argued out in public debate. The problem with politicians paying attention to the views of political blogs, such as Conservative Home, which I think was a long way ahead of Labour Party activists in setting up their own blogs. The problem with politicians paying attention to such views is that they are unrepresentative, not only in public opinion, but of the issues they actually need to address. So I hope that blogs diminish in influence, but I'm not very sanguine about that prospect.
I'm still struggling, forgive me, it's the maths person in me, to understand how your theory, which is that blogs are, by some definition, inimical to good politics, can hold up when it must be possible to find evidence of some people who blog, who do not try to reduce everything to the single lens of a single view of a single party's ideology. And I'm thinking of, well, of course, I'm the weirdo activist, obviously, here. But I'm thinking of Danny Finkelstein. How could you possibly read the blogs that Danny Finkelstein reads and think that man is trying to limit public debate by forcing a single rigid view of the world onto his newspaper, onto the party which he supports? He's not doing that. He's expressing opinions freely and inviting comment upon them. And one of the things I remember is if a theory can be found to be wrong in a particular instance, then it's not the particular instance that's wrong, it's the theory.
But he's a newspaper man. He's a newspaper man.
He's a blogger as well.
He's a newspaper man who chooses to communicate with the readership through a blog. I'm not talking about journalists who have blogs. I'm talking about the phenomenon of, terrible term, but I use it, the blogosphere. And I'll give you an empirical example. In 2005, Cass Sunstein, the American law academic, did a test in which he assembled, this is not specifically about blogs, it's about the polarization of opinion, in which he assembled a group of self-identified conservatives and liberals and asked them 3 questions, which were, as far as I remember, whether you favour civil partnerships of same-sex couples, whether you favour affirmative action for historically groups that have suffered historic discrimination, and whether you favour particular action to mitigate climate change. Unsurprisingly, conservatives and liberals took broadly dissimilar views on these subjects. But what Sunstein found was that the militancy with which they held those views was very much greater if they had discussed them within their ideological, among their ideological peers. And this is what bloggers do. They are not part of political debate. They are an echo chamber on the left and on the right, constantly pushing out the centre of political gravity in the extreme to really bizarre conspiracy theories. And this is, I have to accept, not simply to do with blogs. This is to do with the digital medium. On many issues, if you, for example, type into Google the abbreviation WTC7, World Trade Center 7, almost all you will get is 9/11 truth sites claiming that the destruction of the Twin Towers and this additional building was due to controlled demolition by persons unknown but heavily implied to be the US government. A crank, disreputable conspiracy theory that is thrown up by the digital medium and each of the subscribers to these sites talking to themselves. You could make the same point about quite non-political subjects. For example, James Shapiro, the literary scholar, Shakespeare biographer, pointed out not long ago that if you type the words Shakespeare and authorship into Google, the sites you get up are these crank conspiracy theories that say it was the Earl of Oxford who wrote the works of Shakespeare, not the actor from Stratford. There's something about the combination of the medium and the fact that blogs encourage a particular point of view, a monolithic point of view that is debasing political argument. Whereas in, for example, the Daily Telegraph, obviously a conservative newspaper, if you read its comment page, you will nonetheless periodically find differing points of view from a more liberal persuasion. The same is true in different ways of The Guardian and The Independent and The Times, but you don't find this in blogs. And blogging as such is diminishing the standard of political debate.
But at the same time, don't you have to give credit to some people who, to people who are looking at these blogs, who you know, might tap that in and get those conspiracy theories, but they then make their own judgments. It's not that everybody goes on there and believes it.
Of course not.
No. And in terms of the people that do believe it, to a certain extent, with all blogs, political, conspiracy, or otherwise, you have the potential to preach to the converted.
Yeah.
I was going to say the conservatives. On the Conservative Home website, for example, people will go on there who presumably want to back up their own opinions a lot of the time.
A lot of Labour Party members comment on it too and enjoy the banter. It's far from this shrill. I'm not part of Conservative Home anymore, but I don't recognise it as this shrill conspiracy chamber that locks out all these anyone with a completely rational view of the world. I think what we're frightened of, I can't disprove your theory, I think you're just tapping into, Oliver, into something that we're all terrified of in modern life, that technology is unleashing this demon of unreason, and the instinctive Tory in me resonates to that definitely, that, you know, you're not a Tory unless you think everything is getting worse and nothing is getting better. But I'm not sure that blogs prove that point. It might just be that all these people think like that anyway, and all that's happened is that we now have a mechanism for hearing what they're thinking. I mean, these things speaking to themselves. I'm aware that we haven't asked anyone's opinion. And you know, does anyone here have a blog? Does anyone here write in a blog?
No, they've got lives, right?
Does anyone comment on the newspaper websites?
I think it's very interesting what you said. I have although...
Can we get a microphone, sorry?
Is there a microphone?
I read Conservative Home a lot, but I have given up reading the comments, precisely because what Oliver has been saying. You know, in fact, I've actually said on the comment columns, I'm not going to read this anymore because it is so shrill. But I'm not sure that it really matters. You know, it's perhaps more widespread now, but otherwise it would have been the sort of thing that was happening down the pub, you know, amongst like-minded people anyway. Now it's probably amongst like-minded people across a greater geographic spread, not necessarily any more of them.
Maybe I can add, I'm not issuing a Jeremiah against the forces of popular opinion. I'm not saying that there's no good to come out of reading blogs. Let me give you a particular example. Within the Conservative side of the argument, there was, I think, a very fruitful debate, partly conducted on Conservative Home, between my good friend and colleague Daniel Finkelstein and Tim Montgomery, a very important intellectual influence in the modern Conservative Party, on the question of tax cuts. In my own small way, though I'm not a Conservative and not part of that debate, I intruded into the argument by supporting Daniel and saying that the Conservative Party really wouldn't be taken seriously if it proposed tax cuts in current economic circumstances. That was a useful debate to have about the economic policy of the party that was likely to come into government, as it did in a coalition, in which response and counter-argument could be made almost instantaneously. And that was a constructive thing to do. But I come back to my point that Daniel is a newspaper man first, using digital technology in order to make his views known instantly on an important subject of public debate. In my view, the phenomenon of political blogging itself is not an outgrowth of newspapers. It's not a means by which commentators, established commentators who understand the rules of evidence and properly address the arguments of their critics. It's not an outgrowth of that, it's a different type of form altogether. It's rather like the difference, if we're talking about digital technology, between Wikipedia and an established encyclopedia employing the views of proper authorities. The appeal of digital technology and the appeal of political blogs is the same. It is that anyone can join in. Now that's the fact of it. The problem is that not everyone, while everyone has a right to contribute, not everyone's contribution should be taken seriously. And these sites have no means of discriminating among them.
I don't think they are. Obviously, they're not all taken as seriously as one another. I'm not going to criticise the newspaper industry at all, since it's kindly told me to guess it's employing me. Yes. But I wonder, we wonder about these self-selected bloggers with the audacity to express their opinion instantly. Who chooses the journalists that have these built-in values to assess evidence? I have to say, as a statistician, I've spent my life, way before blogs started, screaming at the Today programme, up to its neck in journalistic values for assessing evidence, essentially reading out the press release from the latest lobby group to come near it. Sort of for a little bit of controversy, but I've heard and there are huge, wonderful exceptions. I genuinely revere Danny Finkelstein. He's at the forefront of the need for a more evidence-based politics, but I see scant evidence of it when I leaf through the pages of any of the papers from any of the political spectrums. The one thing our politics lacks, this is not the topic, sorry, but it quite fuels me. The one thing we lack in politics is a proper understanding of evidence and how to weigh it. The rise of voices on blogs has nothing to do with its lack hitherto in the established institutions of information dissemination.
It strikes me slightly, Oliver, that you are poacher turned gamekeeper.
Oh, I don't claim to be consistent, I claim to be right.
That's a relief, we understand.
And one of the things that got me in trouble with Tim, I wrote an article, a piece once about the need for incoherent conservatism. I totally agree with you. The worst failing in modern politics is this search for a set of axiomatic driven principles that will never be in opposition with one another. That way lies madness.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
well, if we're acceding to each other's point of view, let me agree entirely that there never has been a golden age in which journalists dispassionately weigh evidence and exercise a pure intellectual responsibility. And there are many, many recent instances in which I can think of some really disgraceful conduct by newspaper polemicists. I wouldn't even dignify them with the term pundit. I mean, let's take Melanie Phillips, whom I like on a personal level, but whose commentaries on the MMR vaccine were something that actively damaged the cause of public health. She subscribed to the now utterly debunked notion of a link between the MMR vaccine and autism, and gave comfort and support to an essentially irrationalist movement that is suspicious of modern science.
as did the Lancet, of course.
As did the Lancet. You're absolutely right. It was a very, very...
I made a negative comment there. I have to disclose that I work for a pharmaceutical company, okay?
That's all right, you're right anyway. It was a prime exercise in intellectual irresponsibility. Melanie also has supported the extraordinary conspiracy theories about the tragic death of Dr. David Kelly on no evidence at all that I can see. That's intellectual irresponsibility. I don't claim that you don't have this in the mainstream media. You certainly do, and you get it in some newspapers much more than others. The Daily Express's obsession with Diana conspiracy theories, the murder of Diana. Beg your pardon, I meant the death of Diana. I'm doing it myself now.
Which of us, though, hasn't wondered for
newspapers, whatever the problems of editorship, of self-regulation, you at least get some chance of a wide-ranging debate within the pages of newspapers. If not individual publications, then newspapers as a group. Blogs, I think, are something else. They appeal to the type of reader who will not read anything else. As I say, you can subscribe to blogs without even surfing the web, and they are a type of argument that is infecting newspaper commentary rather than informing it. So I was about to say I'm not making broad generalisations, but actually I am. But I think the truth in it is beyond argument.
Anybody have any comments to make on what they've heard so far? I'm keen to bring you into the discussion.
Sorry, this is just a quick question in relation to taking a step back, I suppose, on the nature of blogs, as to whether they are perhaps this self-feeding mechanism inside the fairly insular world of the Westminster Village, perhaps, and appear to have take on a greater significance there when you're living in that particular world, rather than, say, amongst the general public, although I accept the point you made about it feeding into newspaper comments. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I think very, very few of the general public read political blogs, but quite a large proportion of parliamentarians do. And this also, I think, has quite a deleterious effect on the quality of public debate, because things that exercise the Westminster Village are not necessarily particularly important. I can't think of any more than one or two stories that have broken in political blogs that have broken in political blogs, as opposed to being picked up by political blogs from mainstream commentary, that have broken new ground in political debate. The one I can think of is the 2004 presidential election, when the comments, the Swift boat affair, when now I mention it, I'm struggling to recall the details, but I think it was...
Swift boat veterans claimed that Kerry hadn't been as an active a participant in...
Exactly so. And some mainstream news channel had cited as evidence a document that turned out to be bogus, and there were resignations ensued as a result. That's the example quoted. I can't think of any others that have derived from blogs specifically. Guido is an example. Who is...
It doesn't function. To answer the young man's question, it sort of gets back to, forgive the solipsism, how I think of myself as being on the outside, looking through the glass at this thing in the Westminster Village. Now, we need journalists on the other side of the glass with their skills. And I hate those passages that say sources close to the minister say, friends of the minister say. But if they weren't there inside, then there's stuff that we wouldn't find out, as we've been seeing recently. What I like, forgive me, and find refreshing about the approach that somebody like Guido says, is that it's free of the disgusting innuendo that has been making me sick in the last few weeks reading about Liam Fox. If they wanted to say that Liam Fox has a gay lover, why didn't they say it? That's what they were on about, isn't it? Or is that just my own weird obsession? Did it occur to anyone? Why did none of these champions of virtue close to the Westminster Village feel able to say that to us? We go back to the expenses scandal as well, and I think the Telegraph predates my presence there. I think we owe the Telegraph admiration for the approach it took in that. But these insiders must have known what was going on about such and such a minister sleeping in her sister's spare room and such a grandee having his house cleaned and stuff that we were all paying for. If you compare the language that was, the silence about it in much of the media, and then the language that was used after the event, I'm not an iconoclast, but I think it's a useful counterweight to have a site like Guido, which isn't afraid to say, that's wrong, that's theft. they're calling that guy gay. You know, the emperor's new clothes sort of thing. It's still outside, and it isn't ever going to be part of the establishment. But it's not, and it has negatives associated with it, obviously, the stuff we've been talking about. But it must, I think, play a useful counterbalance. Otherwise, we just have to take what we're given. Don't we? I've got no way of knowing when friends close to the minister say such and such. Is that the minister? Is it an opponent?
Can I come back to a question you asked me in the first place, which I think I didn't answer, which was, are left-wing blogs coalescing in a similar way to the success of Conservative Home? I think they probably are. For some reason, which I don't know the answer to, the right of centre, the right of political centre, tends to steal a march on the left in the field of digital technology and particularly in this method of communication. When political blogging really started a decade or so ago, the two sites that stood out were, one was called Instapundit, which was essentially a magazine of right-wing snippets, and the other was Andrew Sullivan, who at that time, he's shifted quite a long way politically since then, but Andrew was a thoughtful conservative columnist, British expatriate in Washington, writing on American affairs for the Sunday Times, schooled in the conservatism of Michael Oakeshott, a very highbrow, organic type of conservative thought. And left-wing blogs came along much later and with much less popularity. In my opinion, what is driving the sort of digital comment and move to digital comment is a combination of the free market libertarianism of the right, particularly the American right, thinking that the citadels of punditry need to be stormed by popular forces, and bringing up the rear the essentially populist left-wing view that expertise needs to be overthrown because it isn't really, because it's a defence of vested interests. And for some reason the left tends to lag on this. I don't myself place much store on independent blog sites, but it just seems to be a sociological fact that conservatives write them more passionately and more actively than those to their left.
Any more comments or questions? Yes, get a mic here. Oh, okay, we'll start here as the mic's closer and then come to you in second, sir.
What really surprises me is that you've got the communication going fast and furious over these blogs and in these different places, but what about accountability? You know, there has to be an accountability somewhere about the quality and value of so many voices.
Yeah, I entirely agree. I entirely agree with the implication of your question. There is not, if you write a blog, you are essentially accountable to no one for the judgments that you make. And there is technically a law of libel to which we are, those of us who write, are all subject. There's an awful lot, forgive me for being self-referential about this, there's an awful lot about me on the internet that is false and plainly libelous that I could win damages for. There is a long article, I forget its exact title, but it's something like The War Criminal Oliver Kahn, written by a couple of far-left theorists. I use the term in a generic sense rather than a descriptive one, in the United States, published on an American Marxist site, Monthly Review, which is highly libelous, which I've never gone after, but where...
Why haven't you gone after it?
I haven't gone after it because the financial returns to me would be hugely negative, and the publicity I would give to libelous material would be far more than it's worth. And moreover, because even if I went after it, which I would have to do because the Times wouldn't represent me, even if I went after it as an individual plaintiff, it would inevitably appear as big media going after small commentators, and there is no way that I could win that. Sometimes, this is slightly tangential, sometimes I believe that it's important to make a stand for truth when history is being traduced. Nothing to do with me, but a very famous case a decade ago in which ITN sued for libel against the magazine LM, which formerly stood for Living Marxism. It became a rather way-out right-wing libertarian magazine which accused ITN correspondents, some of you will remember this, it accused ITN correspondents in Bosnia in the 1990s of faking their evidence. This was a tiny magazine with a small circulation whose lies, and they were lies, and aspersions on the professionalism of ITN journalists got picked up in all sorts of places. And ITN took the very fine decision that it would sue this small magazine for libel. It won in a High Court action, which led to the closure of the magazine. In my view, and I followed the case at the time, talked to the journalists involved, in my view, ITN were entirely justified in doing that because the issue was so big, whether the Bosnian Serbs in 1992 had indeed imprisoned Bosniaks in concentration camps behind barbed wire. The issue was so big that it was important for historical truth that the issue was laid to rest, and ITN was justified in defending the probity of its journalists, asserting the probity of its journalists. Where libels against individual journalists, including me, are concerned, that go out across the blogosphere and elsewhere, I take an absolute rule of never replying and never pursuing blogs. It's just not worth it, and I don't. Even though I'm a near absolutist on free speech, I think there are times when a libel law ought to be invoked, but I'm not going to do it in the case of blogs, and I'm not going to do it with small publications. But the answer to your question, or the answer to your the issue you raise of the accountability of these sites, it's zero.
You raise, as Oliver said, an incredibly important point. The lack of accountability is frightening. And again, I think this goes beyond blogs, so I think this is some part of the dehumanizing aspect of our modern life. We seem to find it harder and harder. You give an excellent political answer. I'm going to try and give a personal one. We seem to find it harder and harder to remember that the people we talk to, write about, are human beings. And it's for that reason I always use my own name when I comment on blogs. I think this is a very useful tool to use. If somebody sends me an email, a hate mail, anonymously, I simply don't read it. If they've at least put their own name to the words that they've used, then I'm willing to listen to them. I don't know why there's so much anonymity used on the internet. Other than that, it's another mechanism we use to forget that the people we're talking to are human beings. This is tangential as well, I don't actually think this is just a function of social media. I think you just need to get on a bus in London these days to see the lack of accountability we take for our actions and the atomising aspect that's having on our society. So I think you touched on a profoundly important point. I don't have an idea of a solution, I'm afraid.
So there is no necessity that the internet would go this way. In the early stages, when Netscape launched its Navigator in the mid-90s, the idea of the information superhighway, or one idea behind it, was that it would connect people in different parts of the world with different experiences and enrich the sum of human knowledge. Now, there are some great benefits. We're talking specifically about political commentary. There are some great benefits to being able to read about issues in parts of the world that are not easy to reach regularly. There are great benefits to reading other media and in different languages if you can. But the main function of social media, and I include political blogging in this, is not to connect people of different experiences, different points of view, living in different regions. It is to put together people who either already know each other or already think alike. Let's take specifically the case of social media. Facebook has proved so popular not by connecting people in different parts of the world, but by building virtual communities out of links between people who already know each other. And political blogs, I think of as rather like that. They connect like-minded people, and they encourage, as Graham rightly points out, or sorry, I'm actually building on a point you made. You didn't point it out. I point out from the observation you made that particularly because it's possible to be anonymous on the internet, it encourages the sort of behaviour that we would never do face to face.
I think we tolerate it more and more, though. If I could build on that, I do despair about the culture we live in now, and I think maybe there is feedback between the explosion in hatred, anonymous hatred, and the way we started treating each other when we are actually face to face. This is a bit heavy for a Sunday evening. You remember the important point about Facebook? It's for all those people who were horrible to you at school to get back in touch with you 20 years later and say, I really liked you at school, do you want to get in touch? No. There's at least an atom of pleasure to be taken from deleting their pseudo-friendship as payback for all those times when they didn't want to be your friend in maths.
I actually think everybody wanted to be your friend in maths, didn't they? Maths was your subject. Gentleman here.
Yeah. Well, yes, actually my question was going to be, half answered it really, because I was going to ask, would it make any difference if it was possible that all replies to blogs should use their real name rather than be anonymous? I've partly gone into that.
Yeah, and it's a desire that I have. You're always unpopular if you make the suggestions. I mean, just out of interest, I do feel quite strongly about that. But whenever anyone writes an article anywhere saying there ought to be you ought to sign off on your own opinion before you post it, it's interesting to read the comments, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the vast majority are saying everything from pseudo-rationalisation, I couldn't possibly do that because my employer would have an opinion, through to just shut it up, you want to control what I'm thinking. Because it's just out of interest, real people, intelligent people. Do you agree with the assertion that people ought to sign off using their own name? Put your hand up if you do agree with that.
And how many of you actually do it? Or would do it?
Does anyone strongly disagree? I'd really like to hear anyone who strongly disagrees.
My employer doesn't have the same it would affect my clients who work for, so I can't use my real name.
It's difficult. I never ever talk about what I do for my main living. It's very difficult because so much of your life reflects upon that, and you have to find a way to sort of glide past it, such that if the people from our human resources department, who I'm sure are the only people who do actually read every word I write, pick up on anything, then you've always got a defence. But it does lead to self-censorship.
Yes.
My point is that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't really care what my employer thinks. I think that act of thinking, should I be saying this? So there's an existential gap between the thought and committing it to when it becomes a real thing is a useful one to have, and putting your name to it is the mechanism by which that happens by
People would
underlying.
do that anyway. National people would do that anyway. Should I be saying this? Is it right to say this? Normal person thinks like that.
I know.
So perhaps this gentleman and others who don't want to commit their name to what they believe want to talk about things that are close to their heart, or that they know about because of their employment.
It's a valid point, but it can't possibly cover 99% of the anonymous comments.
No, we're talking about different things. We're talking about the scatological, abusive comments that you get under blogs, and including newspaper blogs, which are obviously destructive of any sort of rational debate. I don't myself take such a hardline view on anonymous comments, precisely for the reason that the gentleman has raised. There may be perfectly good reasons for injecting a view into public debate without putting your name to it. Though, like you, I tend to take more seriously those comments that have a proper name attached. It's not the main reason that I would treat a particular viewpoint with greater or lesser respect. It inevitably comes down to other things, whether it's grammatical, whether it's the type of letters that all journalists get, which go on in metaphorical green ink, or whether it's measured and competent and comprehensible.
You do get some nice ones as well. I didn't realise, a lady from Glasgow sent me a beautiful handwritten letter, and I started in the Telegraph. So it was so nice that a Scotsman's writing in the Telegraph, and a conservative voice at that, and it's so good to read you there. At least it's not another one of these awful homosexuals. Yours sincerely, Mrs. Morrison. Thanks for that.
I think we have to make this one the last question.
Okay, but just on this question of anonymity, could not blogs also use the same technique as newspapers do? I mean, I think no newspaper should ever print somebody's name and then say by email, will to be located, rather than just print by email. But we read lots of letters that say name and address supplied, and all blogs are moderated, and so you tell the moderator, could you please withhold my name because, and if he thinks, well, that's fair enough, I will, and otherwise you have to say who you are.
Yeah, that's perfectly reasonable. I think it comes down to the editorial policy of the blogger. But when I had a blog before I joined the Times, I didn't moderate the comments before they were posted. Once I joined the Times, I had to do so. I didn't moderate the comments before they were posted. I had the ability to filter out particular words. So I put down all the obvious obscenities.
That must have been fun, writing.
It's you get to know them in my profession, and so they went straight to spam. Occasionally, things, for example, there was a Holocaust denier who would just cut and paste long material. Massive bits, probably the same one, which I just couldn't work out how to filter that, because you can't very well put the word Holocaust as a banned term, or Jew. I just had to delete it on site when it was there, and I would delete it on site because it's just racism. But different blogs have different editorial policies. There's no getting around that.
Well, I think we will have to leave it there. That's all of the time that we have left. Thank you very much for joining in and making it such a lively discussion. We will be taking your exact names on the way out.
I should be writing a picture. It's an anonymous blog.
Please join me in thanking our panel, and also thank you to the Orwell Prize once again.